Case 1, Michelle Lodzinski, May 25, 1991, Middlesex County, New Jersey. There are some cases that stay with a community for years, not just because of what happened, but because of the questions that never fully go away. This is one of those cases. On a warm spring evening in late May 1991, a 5-year-old boy named Timothy Wilty disappeared from a crowded carnival in Seville, New Jersey. What began as a missing child report quickly grew into one of the most widely discussed investigations in the state's history, a case that would take decades to reach the courtroom and continue to raise difficult legal questions even after a verdict was delivered. At the center of it all was Timothy's mother, Michelle Lodzinski. From the very beginning, investigators worked to understand what happened that night. But this was not a case built on clear answers. Instead, it would become a long and complex process shaped by circumstantial evidence, involving forensic analysis, and the challenge of proving what could not be directly seen. More than 30 years later, the case would reach the highest court in New Jersey, and the outcome would leave many people divided. Because sometimes, even after years of investigation, the most important question remains the hardest to answer. What really happened that night? To understand what happened to Timothy Wilty, you have to understand the world he was born into. Timothy was 5 years old in the spring of 1991. By every account gathered by investigators and journalists who later covered this case, he was a small, bright-eyed boy with a wide smile. He lived with his mother, Michelle Lodzinski, in the Seville area of Middlesex County. Michelle was in her early 20s at the time, a young mother raising Timothy largely on her own. The relationship between Timothy's parents had ended, and the details of that household, the pressures on Michelle, the circumstances of their daily life would later become central to the questions prosecutors spent years trying to answer. May 25, 1991 was a Saturday. It was Memorial Day weekend, the kind of warm New Jersey evening that pulls families outdoors. Michelle Lodzinski took her son Timothy to the Raritan Center Carnival in Seville, a traveling fairground that had set up in the area for the holiday weekend. Carnivals like this one were ordinary community events, rides, food stands, crowds of parents, and children moving through the lights and noise together. Nothing about the setting suggested that the evening would end in catastrophe. According to the account that Michelle Lodzinski gave to law enforcement that night, she and Timothy were separated in the crowd. She told investigators that she had looked away for a moment the way any parent might in a noisy, crowded space, and when she turned back, Timothy was gone. She reported her son missing to local authorities that same evening. The search that followed was immediate and wide. Volunteers, law enforcement, search teams, all mobilized across Middlesex County in the days after Timothy disappeared. His face appeared on flyers. His name circulated through the community, but Timothy Wilty was not found. Not that night, not that week, not that month. The search stretched across the summer of 1991 and into the fall. Investigators pursued every lead available to them. They recanvassed the carnival site. They interviewed witnesses who had been at the fairground that evening. They spoke to neighbors, family members, and anyone connected to Michelle Lodzinski and her son. Through all of it, Michelle maintained the account she had given from the beginning, that she had lost Timothy in the crowd, that she had searched for him desperately, and that she had no idea what had happened to him. Law enforcement, however, began developing a different picture. As investigators deepened their examination of the circumstances around Timothy's disappearance, inconsistencies in Michelle Lodzinski's account began to surface, details that did not fully align, behavioral observations that struck detectives as unusual for a mother in genuine distress. The investigation was far from closed, but the case had no physical evidence to drive it forward. Timothy had not been found. Without a body, without forensic evidence, the investigation stalled in the way that cold cases so often do. Not abandoned, but suspended, waiting for something new. That something new came nearly a full year later. In April of 1992, approximately 11 months after Timothy Wilty vanished from the Raritan Center Carnival, the partial remains of a young child were discovered in Edison, New Jersey, not far from where Timothy had last been seen. The discovery was made along a stretch of the Arthur Kill Road area in terrain that had been searched, but not thoroughly enough to reveal what had been concealed there. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Timothy Wilty. The confirmation of Timothy's fate changed the nature of the investigation permanently. This was no longer a missing child case. It was a homicide investigation, and the focal point of that investigation from the perspective of Middlesex County detectives remained Michelle Lodzinski. What followed over the next 2 decades was one of the most prolonged investigative and legal processes in Middlesex County history. Investigators never stopped working the case. Evidence that had been collected in 1991 and 1992 was periodically re-examined as forensic technology improved. Witness accounts were revisited. The case file remained active even as years turned into a decade and a decade turned into 2. The break that prosecutors had been waiting for came in the form of physical evidence that had been collected years earlier, but whose significance had not been fully established at the time. A piece of fabric, specifically a car seat cover, had been recovered near the location where Timothy's remains were found. For years, investigators had held on to this evidence without being able to definitively connect it to Michelle Lodzinski. Then, in the period leading up to her eventual arrest, forensic analysis provided a connection that prosecutors believed was significant enough to bring the case to trial. Michelle Lodzinski was arrested in 2014, more than 23 years after Timothy disappeared from the carnival in Seville. She was charged with murder in the first degree. The arrest sent shock waves through Middlesex County and through the broader New Jersey true crime community, which had followed this case through decades of speculation and unanswered questions. For the families, for the investigators who had worked the case across multiple generations of law enforcement, and for the community that remembered those flyers with Timothy's face on them, the arrest represented a long, overdue moment of legal reckoning. The trial of Michelle Lodzinski took place in 2016, 25 years after her son's remains were discovered near Edison. It was a circumstantial case. There were no eyewitnesses to what had happened to Timothy on the night he disappeared, and the prosecution built its argument around physical evidence, behavioral patterns, and the forensic connection to the car seat cover. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Michelle Lodzinski had caused her son's death. The jury disagreed. After deliberation, Michelle Lodzinski was convicted of murder in the first degree in Middlesex County Superior Court. She was sentenced to 30 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for law enforcement, for prosecutors, and for those who had advocated for justice for Timothy Wilty across 3 decades. The verdict represented the culmination of one of the longest cold case investigations in New Jersey history. But the legal story was not over. Michelle Lodzinski's defense team pursued appeals through the New Jersey court system, challenging the conviction on the grounds that the evidence presented at trial was legally insufficient to support a verdict of first-degree murder. The appeals process moved through the lower appellate courts and ultimately reached the New Jersey Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority in the state. In December of 2021, the New Jersey Supreme Court issued its ruling. In a decision that stunned many observers and reignited public debate about the case, the court overturned Michelle Lodzinski's murder conviction. The justices found that the evidence presented at trial, while circumstantial and deeply troubling in its implications, did not meet the legal standard required to sustain a first-degree murder conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling was not an exoneration. The court did not declare Michelle Lodzinski innocent. It was a legal determination that the evidence presented was insufficient for the conviction to stand under New Jersey law. Michelle Lodzinski was released from custody following the ruling. She was no longer in prison as of December 2021, and the state of New Jersey did not pursue a retrial. The legal outcome left the community of Middlesex County and the broader public that had followed this case for 30 years in a deeply conflicted place. For those who believed in Lodzinski's guilt, the ruling felt like a second loss. First Timothy, then justice. For those who held concerns about the sufficiency of the evidence from the beginning, the ruling affirmed the constitutional safeguards that exist within the American legal system. For Timothy Wilty himself, who never had the chance to grow up, to go to school, to have a life beyond those 5 years, the outcome of the courtroom could not reach the fullness of what had been lost. Timothy Wilty would have been 35 years old in 2021. He never got that chance. The New Jersey Supreme Court's ruling in the Lodzinski case has since been studied in legal circles as an important example of how courts evaluate circumstantial evidence in cold case prosecutions. It raised significant questions about the balance between the passage of time, the evolution of forensic science, and the enduring constitutional requirement that guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Those questions do not have easy answers, and they are part of why this case continues to be discussed by legal scholars, law enforcement professionals, and true crime researchers across the country. What remains constant in every version of the story is Timothy, a 5-year-old boy at a carnival on a warm May evening. A child who should have grown up in Middlesex County, New Jersey, in a life full of ordinary moments. His absence is the center of his story, and his name, Timothy Wiltsey, deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to legal debate, but as the reason this case mattered at all. The child safety organizations working in New Jersey and across the country remind us that cases like Timothy's are why child protection systems, community awareness programs, and public accountability in the legal process all matter. Groups such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continue to advocate for children who have no voice of their own because every child deserves to be safe, to be found, and to be remembered. Justice for Timothy Wiltsey may not look the way that many people hoped it would, but the documentation of what happened to him, the decades of investigation, the courtroom battles, and the community that never forgot his face on those flyers, all of it stands as a record that his life mattered, that his loss was never accepted as ordinary, and that the people of New Jersey refused to let his story disappear the way he did on that May evening so many years ago. If this case moved you the way it moves everyone who learns about Timothy Wiltsey, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment below, and make sure you have subscribed to Cold Case Hour. Every subscription helps this channel continue bringing these stories to light because these children and their families deserve to be heard. Case 2. Naomi Elkins, June 25, 2024, Ocean County, New Jersey. There are cases that challenge every framework we use to understand why harm comes to children. Cases where the facts are not in dispute, where the outcome is confirmed by court records and medical evidence, but where the question of how to categorize what happened legally, morally, and as a society produces no clean or comfortable answer. The case of Naomi Elkins in Ocean County, New Jersey, is precisely that kind of case. It is a case that the court system ultimately resolved through a finding that removed criminal culpability. And yet the two children at the center of the story, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, remain the irreplaceable loss around which everything else in this case revolves. Naomi Elkins lived in Lakewood, Ocean County, New Jersey, a community in the central coastal region of the state. Lakewood is a large, densely populated township that has experienced significant demographic growth over the past 2 decades, and it carries within it the full complexity of a diverse, layered community navigating the pressures of modern life. Naomi Elkins was a young mother. She had 2 daughters. The elder was 3 years old. The younger had only recently celebrated her first birthday. By every measure that courts and child welfare investigators use to evaluate a home environment, those 2 little girls were at the beginning of their lives. On June 25, 2024, those lives ended. What happened inside the Elkins residence on that day was documented through the emergency response, the medical examiner's findings, and the subsequent criminal investigation conducted by Ocean County law enforcement. Both girls were found in a condition that required emergency medical response. Despite those efforts, neither child survived. The medical and forensic determination established that both children had been drowned in the bathtub inside the family home. When law enforcement took Naomi Elkins into custody and began the formal investigative process, what emerged from that process was a statement from Elkins herself that became central to every subsequent legal proceeding. According to court records and reporting from multiple New Jersey media outlets, including NJ.com and the Asbury Park Press, Naomi Elkins told investigators that she had harmed her daughters for what she described as religious purposes. She stated that she believed her children were possessed by evil and that she had acted to eliminate that evil through the only means she believed was available to her. That statement set the course for everything that followed. Ocean County prosecutors charged Naomi Elkins with 2 counts of murder in the first degree. The charges reflected the severity of what had occurred. 2 children, both under the age of 4, had lost their lives inside a home that should have been the safest place in the world for them. The case drew significant media attention both within New Jersey and nationally, not only because of the age of the victims, but because of the specific nature of the account that Elkins had provided to investigators. The intersection of religious belief, mental health, and criminal accountability in cases involving harm to children is one of the most legally and ethically contested areas of American jurisprudence. And this case placed all of those tensions directly before the Ocean County court system. The legal process that followed the charges involved extensive psychiatric evaluation of Naomi Elkins. Under New Jersey law, a defendant who raises an insanity defense must undergo comprehensive mental health examination by court-appointed experts. Multiple forensic psychiatrists evaluated Elkins over the course of the legal proceedings. Their findings, as ultimately accepted by the court, established that at the time of the events on June 25, 2024, Naomi Elkins was suffering from a severe psychiatric condition that impaired her ability to understand the nature of her actions or to distinguish between right and wrong in the legal sense required for criminal culpability. This is the legal standard for not guilty by reason of insanity in the state of New Jersey. Not simply that a person was mentally ill, and not simply that they were experiencing distressing symptoms, but that the severity of the mental illness at the specific moment of the act prevented them from understanding what they were doing or from understanding that it was wrong. It is a high legal bar, deliberately so, and it is a determination made by courts only after rigorous examination. In the case of Naomi Elkins, that bar was met to the satisfaction of the Ocean County Court. In April of 2025, Naomi Elkins was found not guilty by reason of insanity on both counts of murder. The verdict was not an acquit in the traditional sense. Elkins was not released and was not declared to bear no responsibility for what happened to her daughters. The finding of not guilty by reason of insanity carries its own specific legal consequence. Under New Jersey law, a defendant found not guilty by reason of insanity in a case. Investigators are working to establish precisely what occurred and which adult was responsible. When the victims are too young to communicate, and when the events took place within a private residence, the investigative process often begins with charges against all adults present or connected to the household while the evidence gathering continues. That process of continued evidence gathering in the case of Caitlin Gibson and Ruben Santiago produced a result that dramatically changed the trajectory of the case. As the investigation deepened and the legal proceedings advanced through the Ocean County court system, Ruben Santiago provided a full account of what had occurred on the day the infant lost her life. Santiago admitted in a formal legal context that would bind him to the consequences of that admission that he alone was responsible for the injuries that caused the child's death. He stated explicitly that Caitlin Gibson had not been present in the home at the time the infant was harmed. He took sole and complete responsibility for what had happened to their daughter. The implications of Santiago's admission for the charges against Caitlin Gibson were both immediate and decisive. Under New Jersey criminal law, a murder charge requires the prosecution to establish that the defendant caused the harm in question or acted in a manner that constituted legal culpability for the harm. If Caitlin Gibson was not present when the infant was harmed, and if the person who caused that harm confirmed her absence and his sole responsibility, the legal foundation for the murder charges against Gibson could not be maintained. In February of 2026, all murder charges against Caitlin Gibson were dismissed by the Ocean County Court. The dismissal was a direct consequence of Santiago's admission and the investigative conclusions that followed from it. Caitlin Gibson was no longer a defendant in the case. Ruben Santiago faced the full weight of the legal proceedings alone, accountable for the admission he had made and for what the forensic evidence established about the infant's injuries. The resolution of this case in relation to Caitlin Gibson raises a set of questions that are worth considering carefully in the context of how we discuss true crime cases and how we think about accountability in child fatality investigations. When an infant loses her life under circumstances that point to harm by an adult, the community's impulse is understandably to seek accountability from everyone who is connected to that household. That impulse is rooted in a legitimate desire to protect children and to ensure that no one escapes responsibility for harm they caused. But the legal system's requirement that charges be supported by evidence and that guilt be established rather than assumed exists precisely to prevent the punishment of people who did not commit the act in question. Caitlin Gibson's charges were not dismissed because the court was indifferent to what happened to her daughter. They were dismissed because the evidence established that she was not the person who caused what happened to her daughter. That distinction is foundational to how justice is supposed to work. The grief of losing a child under any circumstances is a weight that exists entirely outside the legal categories of guilt and innocence. Whatever the court determined about Caitlin Gibson's legal culpability, the fact of her daughter's absence, 3 months old, a life that had barely begun, is a loss that does not resolve with a legal ruling. It remains. Ruben Santiago's case continued through the Ocean County court system, following his admission with prosecutors pursuing the full range of charges that his conduct warranted under New Jersey law. The accountability framework that the legal system builds for cases involving the most serious harm to the most vulnerable victims is designed to be thorough, and the documentation of his responsibility in this case stands as part of that accountability record. For investigators, prosecutors, and child welfare advocates working in Ocean County and across New Jersey, cases like this one underscore the critical importance of thorough evidence-driven. Involving first-degree murder is committed to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment with ongoing judicial oversight governing all future determinations about their confinement or release. The court's sentencing framework in the Elkins case produced a period of commitment that was calculated as equivalent to 2 life terms, a figure that news coverage reported as approximately 150 years. This framing reflected the court's determination that the safety of the public required long-term secure psychiatric commitment, even within the framework of a mental health verdict rather than a criminal sentence. Naomi Elkins was remanded to a secure psychiatric hospital where she remains under court-ordered treatment and confinement as the case stands today. The legal outcome in the Elkins case prompted wide-ranging public discussion in New Jersey about how the criminal justice system handles cases at the intersection of severe mental illness and harm to children. For many members of the public, the not guilty finding, regardless of the secure commitment that followed, was difficult to process in the context of 2 young girls who did not survive. For mental health advocates and legal scholars, the case illustrated why the insanity defense exists within the legal system at all. Because a system that punishes people regardless of their mental state at the time of an act is not a system that fully accounts for the complexity of human psychology and illness. Neither perspective makes the loss of those 2 children easier to hold. The younger daughter had only been alive for 1 year. The older had only reached her 3rd birthday. They did not have the capacity to understand what was happening to them or why. They trusted the person who was supposed to protect them. That trust was the most devastating element of this case, not because it was betrayed by malice in the traditional criminal sense, but because it was overridden by a reality that the court determined was beyond Naomi Elkins's capacity to control in that moment. Ocean County's child welfare and mental health infrastructure has been examined in the aftermath of this case, with advocates pushing for stronger systems of early intervention for parents experiencing mental health crisis, particularly those involving religious or delusional ideation that may place children at risk. The work of organizations like the New Jersey Department of Children and Families and national groups focused on postpartum and parental mental health advocacy remains essential because identifying and supporting parents in crisis before tragedy occurs is the only intervention that can actually protect children at the earliest possible moment. The names of Naomi Elkins's daughters deserve to be spoken with care and with the full weight of what their short lives represented. They were real children. They had names and faces and the beginning of personalities. They had a future that was taken from them on a June afternoon in Lakewood, Ocean County. Whatever the legal framework that the court applied to their case, the fact of their lives and the fact of their loss is not diminished by any verdict. Ocean County prosecutors, law enforcement, and the medical professionals who responded on June 25, 2024, all worked within a system designed to pursue accountability while also navigating the complex realities of mental health law. The outcome of this case will continue to be discussed in New Jersey legal and advocacy circles for years to come. The questions it raises about how we protect children, how we identify and treat parents in crisis, and how the legal system balances justice with mental health reality are questions that communities across America are actively grappling with right now. If this case prompted reflection in you about the importance of mental health resources and child protection systems in our communities, please share it. Like this video. Drop a comment letting us know your thoughts on the legal outcome. And make sure you are subscribed to Cold Case Hour. These conversations matter. The children at the center of the matter. Case 3. Caitlin Gibson, May 5, 2025, Ocean County, New Jersey. Not every case in the true crime documentary space is a story of guilt confirmed and accountability delivered. Some cases are stories about how the legal system works in its most foundational sense, how charges are evaluated against evidence, how responsibility is assigned only where the proof actually leads, and how the pursuit of justice sometimes requires distinguishing between the person who was present in a household and the person who caused harm within it. The case involving Caitlin Gibson in Lakewood, Ocean County, is a case that the legal system ultimately resolved in a way that few people anticipated when the initial charges were filed. And its resolution carries lessons about the precision that the pursuit of justice requires. Lakewood Township in Ocean County, New Jersey, had already been the location of a deeply devastating child welfare case just months before the events surrounding Caitlin Gibson came to the attention of investigators. The May of 2025 case involving Gibson centered on the death of her infant daughter, a child who had only been alive for 3 months. 3 months is a span of time so brief that the child would not yet have developed the ability to recognize faces fully or to sit unassisted. She would have been entirely dependent on the adults in her world for every moment of her survival. That dependency, and the profound vulnerability it represented, was at the heart of the tragedy that unfolded in Lakewood during the early weeks of May 2025. On May 5, 2025, emergency services responded to the Gibson residence in Lakewood following a report involving a 3-month-old infant. The medical response determined that the child had suffered injuries of a severe nature. The infant did not survive. The forensic and medical examination that followed the child's death established that her injuries were consistent with the kind of physical harm that does not occur through accident or ordinary household incident. The examination findings indicated that the infant had been subjected to severe physical force. Ocean County prosecutors moved forward with charges against 2 individuals in connection with the infant's death. Caitlin Gibson, the child's mother, and Ruben Santiago, the child's father. Both were charged with murder in connection with the infant's death. The charging of both parents at the outset of a case involving an infant is not uncommon in situations where investigators are working to establish precisely what occurred and which adult was responsible. When the victims are too young to communicate, and when the events took place within a private residence, the investigative process often begins with charges against all adults present or connected to the household while the evidence gathering continues. That process of continued evidence gathering in the case of Caitlin Gibson and Ruben Santiago produced a result that dramatically changed the trajectory of the case. As the investigation deepened and the legal proceedings advanced through the Ocean County court system, Ruben Santiago provided a full account of what had occurred on the day the infant lost her life. Santiago admitted in a formal legal context that would bind him to the consequences of that admission that he alone was responsible for the injuries that caused the child's death. He stated explicitly that Caitlin Gibson had not been present in the home at the time the infant was harmed. He took sole and complete responsibility for what had happened to their daughter. The implications of Santiago's admission for the charges against Caitlin Gibson were both immediate and decisive. Under New Jersey criminal law, a murder charge requires the prosecution to establish that the defendant caused the harm in question or acted in a manner that constituted legal culpability for the harm. If Caitlin Gibson was not present when the infant was harmed, and if the person who caused that harm confirmed her absence and his sole responsibility, the legal foundation for the murder charges against Gibson could not be maintained. In February of 2026, all murder charges against Caitlin Gibson were dismissed by the Ocean County Court. The dismissal was a direct consequence of Santiago's admission and the investigative conclusions that followed from it. Caitlin Gibson was no longer a defendant in the case. Ruben Santiago faced the full weight of the legal proceedings alone, accountable for the admission he had made and for what the forensic evidence established about the infant's injuries. The resolution of this case in relation to Caitlin Gibson raises a set of questions that are worth considering carefully in the context of how we discuss true crime cases and how we think about accountability in child fatality investigations. When an infant loses her life under circumstances that point to harm by an adult, the community's impulse is understandably to seek accountability from everyone who is connected to that household. That impulse is rooted in a legitimate desire to protect children and to ensure that no one escapes responsibility for harm they caused. But the legal system's requirement that charges be supported by evidence and that guilt be established rather than assumed exists precisely to prevent the punishment of people who did not commit the act in question. Caitlin Gibson's charges were not dismissed because the court was indifferent to what happened to her daughter. They were dismissed because the evidence established that she was not the person who caused what happened to her daughter. That distinction is foundational to how justice is supposed to work. The grief of losing a child under any circumstances is a weight that exists entirely outside the legal categories of guilt and innocence. Whatever the court determined about Caitlin Gibson's legal culpability, the fact of her daughter's absence, 3 months old, a life that had barely begun, is a loss that does not resolve with a legal ruling. It remains. Ruben Santiago's case continued through the Ocean County court system following his admission, with prosecutors pursuing the full range of charges that his conduct warranted under New Jersey law. The accountability framework that the legal system builds for cases involving the most serious harm to the most vulnerable victims is designed to be thorough, and the documentation of his responsibility in this case stands as part of that accountability record. For investigators, prosecutors, and child welfare advocates working in Ocean County and across New Jersey, cases like this one underscore the critical importance of thorough evidence-driven investigation in child fatality cases. The pressure to move quickly, to assign charges broadly, and to satisfy the community's demand for accountability is real and understandable. But the cases that ultimately serve justice best are the ones where investigators follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to a conclusion that is different from the initial charging framework. The 3-month-old child at the center of this case deserved a life. She deserved every day beyond those 3 months. She deserved to grow up in a world where the adults responsible for her safety protected her with everything they had. That she did not get that chance is the truest and most irreducible fact of the story. And it is the reason that this case, like every case involving the most vulnerable victims, demands to be told with complete honesty about what happened and who was responsible. If you are watching this and thinking about the children in your own community who depend on the adults around them for their safety and well-being, we encourage you to look into the resources offered by the New Jersey Department of Children and Families, which provide support, crisis intervention, and reporting mechanisms for anyone concerned about a child's welfare. Protecting children is a community responsibility, and staying informed is the first step. Please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if you have not already done so. This work matters because these children matter. Case 4, Catherine Bannister, December 5, 2018, Mercer County, New Jersey. Some cases in the New Jersey court record do not fit cleanly into the categories that people expect when they think about accountability for harm to children. They do not end with dramatic sentencing hearings or with the kind of definitive legal conclusion that provides the community with a clear sense that justice has been served in full. They end instead in the gray space of legal resolution, where the system determined that a consequence existed, but where the nature of that consequence left many people questioning whether the weight of what occurred was fully accounted for. The case of Catherine Bannister in Yuhwei Township, Mercer County, is one of those cases. And it is a case that warrants careful examination precisely because of the questions it refuses to answer easily. Yuhwei Township sits in Mercer County in central New Jersey, adjacent to Trenton and the surrounding communities that make up the county seat region of the state. It is a suburban community with quiet residential streets and the kind of ordinary neighborhood landscape that makes the events that occurred inside the Bannister home on December 5, 2018, all the more difficult to comprehend from the outside looking in. On that day in December, emergency services were called to the Bannister residence in Yuhwei Township. The call involved a 3-month-old infant, a girl named Haley. When first responders arrived, they found Haley in a condition that required immediate emergency medical intervention. She was transported to a medical facility where physicians who examined her documented findings that shocked the medical team. Haley had suffered a fractured skull and broken ribs. These were not injuries associated with any form of accidental event in the life of a 3-month-old child. The forensic medical literature is unambiguous on this point. The specific injuries documented in Haley's case are among those that the medical and legal communities categorize as indicators of non-acute physical harm in infants. Haley Bannister survived the initial medical emergency, but the nature of her injuries and the circumstances that produced them were now the subject of a criminal investigation by Mercer County law enforcement. The investigation focused on the two adults in Haley's immediate household, her father, Daniel Bannister, and her mother, Catherine Bannister. Daniel Bannister's circumstances carried an additional dimension that intensified public attention to the case. Daniel was an active law enforcement officer, a police officer, working in the New Jersey area at the time of the events. The fact that a member of law enforcement was alleged to have caused harm to an infant in his own home created a layer of public scrutiny that extended well beyond what such a case might ordinarily generate. Mercer County prosecutors charged Daniel Bannister with murder in connection with the injuries that Haley had suffered. The charge reflected the severity of what the medical evidence established about the nature and cause of the infant's injuries. Catherine Bannister, as the child's mother, was charged with reckless manslaughter, a charge that centered not on the allegation that she directly caused Haley's injuries, but on the legal theory that her conduct in the context of the household created a reckless disregard for the danger Haley faced. The distinction between Daniel's charge and Catherine's charge is legally significant and worth understanding clearly. New Jersey law distinguishes between acts of direct causation and acts that constitute reckless failure to prevent foreseeable harm. Catherine Bannister was not accused of directly causing Haley's injuries. She was accused of conduct, or the failure of conduct that the law characterized as recklessly disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk to her daughter. Whether she knew or should have known that Haley was in danger, and what actions she took or failed to take in response to that danger were the central questions that the charge against her required the court to address. The Bannister case moved through the Mercer County court system over the years following the December 2018 incident. It was not a rapid prosecution. Cases involving harm to infants within family households often involve complex legal negotiations, extensive forensic review, and significant pretrial proceedings that can extend over months or years before resolution. The Bannister case followed that pattern, with both defendants and their legal teams engaged in extended proceedings that ultimately produced a resolution that was not the full criminal trial many observers had anticipated. In August of 2024, nearly 6 years after the events of December 5, 2018, the Bannister case was resolved through a pretrial intervention agreement that applied to both Daniel and Catherine. Pretrial intervention, known in New Jersey as PTI, is a prosecutorial tool that allows defendants in certain cases to avoid traditional prosecution by completing a supervised program of requirements set by the court. PTI is generally available to first-time offenders and is subject to prosecutorial approval. Its application, in a case that had begun with charges of murder against one defendant and reckless manslaughter against the other, was notable and drew significant public attention when the resolution was announced. Under the terms of the PTI agreement, neither Daniel nor Catherine Bannister went to prison. Catherine Bannister's specific conditions of the agreement included the forfeit of her teaching certificate, effectively ending her career as an educator in the state of New Jersey. The loss of a professional license as part of a PTI resolution is one of the mechanisms available to courts and prosecutors to attach consequence to conduct even when traditional incarceration is not pursued. Haley Bannister, the 3-month-old infant who was found with a fractured skull and broken ribs in Yuhwei Township on December 5, 2018, was the person at the center of all of these proceedings. Her injuries, her survival of the initial medical emergency, and the years of legal proceedings that followed her case represent a period of her life that began in the most devastating way imaginable for a child. The public response to the PTI resolution in this case was strong. Many community members, child advocacy organizations, and legal observers expressed concern that the resolution did not fully reflect the gravity of the harm that had been documented. Those concerns are part of the legitimate ongoing conversation that New Jersey communities continue to have about how the legal system handles cases involving severe harm to infants and about the standards that should govern prosecutorial decisions in such cases. Child advocacy groups in New Jersey and nationally point to cases like Haley Bannister's as part of the broader argument for strengthening the legal protections available to the most vulnerable victims. Children who cannot advocate for themselves, who cannot choose their households, and who depend entirely on the adults around them for their safety and survival. The work of organizations like Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey reflects the community commitment to ensuring that harm to children is never treated as ordinary or acceptable, regardless of how the legal proceedings surrounding individual cases resolve. Haley Bannister was 3 months old in December of 2018. The life that began for her in those early months continues. Whatever the legal outcomes that surrounded the events of that December, Haley's life goes forward, and the community's responsibility to ensure that children like her are protected remains constant. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so that these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Cases like Haley's are why child protection awareness matters every single day. Case 5, Monique Durham, Discovery of Remains, 2021, New Jersey. There are cases in the New Jersey court record that are defined not by a single documented incident on a specific date, but by a pattern of years. Years during which a child was absent, years during which questions went unanswered, and years during which the systems that exist to protect children failed to catch what was happening until it was far too late. The case of Monique Durham is one of those cases. It is a case about absence, a child who disappeared from the safety net of visibility that should surround every young person, and the devastating discovery that came years later when investigators finally confronted what that disappearance had concealed. The specific details of Monique Durham's case unfold within the context of New Jersey's child welfare and law enforcement systems, both of which were implicated in the narrative that emerged when investigators began to piece together the timeline of what had happened. What is documented in the court record and in the investigative findings is a story that extends across multiple years of a child's life and then across the years after that child was no longer alive. The case came to the attention of New Jersey law enforcement through the discovery in 2021 of remains that were ultimately identified as belonging to Monique Durham's daughter. The child had been missing for a period of time prior to this discovery, not missing in the formal sense of an open investigation with active search efforts, but missing in the sense that she had fallen out of the view of the institutions and community systems that track the existence and welfare of children, schools, social services, neighbors, family members. The network of contact points that collectively constitute the informal monitoring system surrounding most children in America had lost track of this child before investigators ever opened a formal case. When investigators began reconstructing the timeline of the child's disappearance and the events that preceded the discovery of her remains, what emerged was a picture of prolonged neglect, a failure of care that extended over a significant period, and that the child experienced without anyone in her external world intervening to change it. The forensic findings associated with the discovery of her remains told a story that reached backward across years, establishing that the child had not been seen or accounted for by any institution or community contact for a substantial period before her remains were found. Monique Durham and the child's father were charged in connection with the case. The charges included endangering the welfare of a child and evidence tampering. The evidence tampering charge reflected investigative findings about what had been done in the period following the child's death. Actions taken, authorities alleged, to prevent the discovery of what had occurred and to avoid the accountability that would follow. The nature of evidence tampering charges in child fatality cases represents one of the most serious aspects of the legal framework because it speaks to a deliberate effort to obscure the truth about a child's fate from the people and institutions that exist to demand accountability for exactly that kind of harm. The Monique Durham case became a focal point for criticism directed at the child welfare oversight systems that had failed to maintain contact with the child during the period of her disappearance from institutional view. In New Jersey, as in every state, the systems designed to monitor the welfare of children at risk operate through a combination of mandatory reporting requirements, school attendance tracking, social services follow-up, and community reporting. When a child falls out of all of these systems simultaneously, and when that disappearance goes unaddressed for an extended period, the failure is systemic rather than individual. It reflects gaps in coordination, communication, and accountability that exist across multiple institutions. The New Jersey Department of Children and Families, which operates the state's child protective services infrastructure, has faced ongoing scrutiny over cases like this one. Advocates for child welfare reform point to the Durham case as an example of why the early warning system surrounding children in vulnerable households must be strengthened, why mandatory reporting protocols must be followed rigorously, and why the failure of any single institution to flag a child's disappearance from view cannot be allowed to translate into a multi-year absence of any protective response. The charges against Monique Durham and the child's father place the responsibility for what happened firmly in the legal record. The evidence tampering component of the charges meant that the court was asked to account not only for the harm the child experienced, but for the deliberate effort to prevent anyone from knowing about it. That second layer of the case, the concealment, is in many ways as significant as the underlying harm, because it speaks to an active choice to deny accountability rather than to the passive failure that neglect sometimes involves. The circumstances of Monique Durham's daughter, a child who died out of sight, whose absence was not flagged for years, and whose remains were discovered in 2021, represent a profound failure at multiple levels. The failure was not only on the part of the adults directly responsible for her care. It was also a failure of the interconnected systems that exist in every community to ensure that children do not disappear from view without someone noticing and demanding answers. In the aftermath of this case, child welfare advocates in New Jersey pushed for enhanced protocols governing the tracking of children who disengage from school enrollment, who stop appearing at regularly scheduled medical appointments, or who otherwise fall out of the documented contact points that communities rely on to know that a child is present and safe. The National Organization Child Welfare League of America has documented the patterns that cases like this one reflect and has advocated for systemic reforms that would make it harder for a child to disappear from institutional view without triggering an immediate investigative response. The child at the center of the Durham case deserved that protection. She deserved to be seen, to be checked on, to have the systems that exist for exactly her benefit function the way they were designed to function. The fact that they did not is a failure that the legal proceedings addressed only in part. The deeper accountability, the institutional accountability, belongs to every community and every system that participates in the protection of vulnerable children. The legal proceedings in the Durham case continued through the New Jersey court system following the filing of charges. The documentation of what occurred and the community's confrontation with the gaps in oversight that allowed it to go undetected for so long are part of the ongoing record that New Jersey's child welfare system must carry forward in its efforts to do better for the children it exists to protect. Like this video if this case reminded you why child protection systems matter in every community. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour and share this content with someone who needs to hear why these stories cannot be forgotten. Case 6, Carolyn Jackson, 2005 through 2010, Morris County, New Jersey. There are certain categories of harm to children that the legal system treats with a particular degree of gravity, not because any harm to a child is anything other than serious, but because some cases involve a deliberate, prolonged, and systematic pattern of conduct that distinguishes them from even the worst single-incident cases. The case of Carolyn Jackson and her husband from Morris County, New Jersey, falls squarely into this category. It is a case that unfolded not over hours or days, but over the course of approximately 5 years, during which a household that had taken on the responsibility of caring for adopted children became the site of conditions that investigators and federal prosecutors described as among the most disturbing they had encountered in their careers. Morris County occupies the northern part of New Jersey, a region of the state that includes both affluent suburban communities and the quieter residential areas that surround them. The Jackson household was located within this county, and from the outside, as is often the case in the most deeply hidden instances of domestic harm, it did not present itself as a place where anything extraordinary was occurring. Carolyn Jackson and her husband had adopted children, taking on the legal and moral responsibility to provide them with the safety, stability, and care that a family home is supposed to represent. For those children, the adoption was supposed to be a second chance, the beginning of a safe life after whatever circumstances had preceded it. What investigators ultimately documented inside the Jackson household told a profoundly different story. The conduct documented in the federal case against Carolyn Jackson and her husband covered the period from approximately 2005 through 2010. 5 full years, during which the children in their care were subjected to conditions that the federal indictment and subsequent trial established as systematic and severe neglect amounting to child endangerment. Among the specific conditions documented and presented in the federal prosecution were the withholding of adequate food, a pattern of deliberate deprivation that left the children in states of severe undernourishment, and practices that included forcing the children to consume hot sauce as a form of punishment. The details of what was documented in the Jackson federal case need to be understood in the context of what those experiences mean for children who endure them. Systematic food deprivation in childhood is not simply an absence of meals. It constitutes a form of harm that affects physical development, neurological function, psychological health, and a child's fundamental sense of safety and worth. When the adults responsible for a child's care use the control of basic necessities as a mechanism of punishment and control, they are engaging in a pattern that the medical and psychological communities recognize as profoundly damaging. Damage that does not end when the physical conditions are resolved, but that follows a child through the years of their development and into adulthood. Federal law enforcement became involved in the Jackson case through the investigative process that ultimately led to the federal indictment. The decision to pursue the case through the federal court system rather than exclusively through state channels reflected both the nature of the specific charges and the prosecutorial determination that the federal framework provided the appropriate mechanism for pursuing accountability in this case. Federal involvement in child endangerment cases is not routine, and its application in the Jackson case signaled the gravity with which the prosecuting authorities viewed what had occurred in that Morris County household. The federal trial of Carolyn Jackson and her husband produced a conviction in 2013. Carolyn Jackson was sentenced to several years in federal prison following her conviction on charges related to child endangerment. The conviction was a legal acknowledgement of the documented record of what those children had experienced during the 5 years between 2005 and 2010. The Jackson case drew significant attention from child welfare advocates and adoption community organizations, both in New Jersey and nationally. Adoption is one of the most profoundly important institutions available to children who need families, and the vast majority of adoptive families provide exactly the safe, loving, and stable environment that the institution is designed to create. But the Jackson case served as a stark reminder that adoptive placements, like all placements of children in family settings, require ongoing oversight and monitoring. That the placement of a child in a home is not the end of a child welfare agency's responsibility, but rather the beginning of a continued obligation to ensure that the home remains safe. Adoption monitoring organizations and child welfare policy advocates have pointed to cases like the Jacksons as part of the broader argument for strengthening the post-placement oversight systems that govern adoptive families. Regular follow-up visits, mandatory check-ins with the children themselves in settings where they can communicate privately with caseworkers, and mandatory reporting protocols for teachers, medical professionals, and other community members who have contact with adopted children. All of these mechanisms exist partly because of cases where systematic harm occurred behind closed doors over extended periods without external detection. For the children who lived through the Jackson household, the years from 2005 to 2010 represent a period of their lives that they carry with them. The legal proceedings that follow their cases produced a record of accountability, and the conviction of Carolyn Jackson in federal court placed that accountability in the permanent legal record of the state and federal court systems. But accountability in court is not the same as healing, and the children at the center of this case needed far more than a verdict to address what they had experienced. The resources available to children who have experienced prolonged household neglect and systematic harm include trauma-informed therapeutic services, educational support systems, and long-term advocacy structures. Organizations like the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, the Children's Defense Fund, and New Jersey-specific child advocacy groups work continuously to ensure that children who have experienced harm within household settings have access to the resources they need to build safe and stable lives. Going forward, the federal court record in the Jackson case stands as documentation of what happened to those children in Morris County between 2005 and 2010. Carolyn Jackson's conviction is a matter of public record, and the children whose experiences form the basis of that case are individuals whose resilience in the face of what they endured is the truest measure of what the legal outcome was fighting for. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These are stories that the children at their center could not tell for themselves, and sharing them is one of the ways we honor the strength it took to survive them. Case 7, Priyatharsini Natarajan, January 13, 2026, Somerset County, New Jersey. Some cases arrive in the public record so recently that the legal system has not yet reached its conclusions. The proceedings are ongoing. The facts as established by the investigation are on record, but the full arc of accountability that the court will ultimately impose has not yet been written. The case of Priyatharsini Natarajan in Hillsborough Township, Somerset County, New Jersey, is exactly this kind of case. It is a case that unfolded in January of 2026, just months before this documentary was produced, and whose legal consequences are still being determined by the Somerset County court system. As you watch this, to tell the story with the precision and seriousness that it deserves, it is important to start with the facts as they have been documented by law enforcement and reported in verified New Jersey press coverage, including NJ.com and Somerset County court filings. Those facts are as follows. Hillsborough Township is a suburban community in Somerset County in the central part of New Jersey. It is a community of residential neighborhoods, families, and the kind of ordinary weekday rhythms that define suburban life across the state. The Natarajan household was part of that community. Priyatharsini Natarajan, her husband, and their 2 young sons, ages 5 and 7, were a family navigating those same rhythms. The children were at ages where they would have been in school, where they would have had friendships and activities, and the full range of experiences that early childhood provides. They were present in the community, in the way that children there. Ages are present, visible, embedded in the network of school and neighborhood and family life. On January 13, 20126, that changed with a finality that no subsequent legal proceeding can reverse. The account established by Somerset County investigators is this. On that day, Priyatharsini Natarajan's husband returned to the family's Hillsborough home from work and made a discovery that prompted an immediate emergency response. The couple's 2 sons, the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old, were found dead inside the home. The emergency services response confirmed what the father had found. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office and the Hillsborough Township Police Department with resources and personnel consistent with a double homicide investigation involving juvenile victims. The investigation produced a determination that led Somerset County prosecutors to charge Priyatharsini Natarajan with 2 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count for each child. She was taken into custody and remanded to the Somerset County Jail, where she is currently being held pending trial. As of the production of this documentary, no trial date has been finalized, and the legal proceedings remain in the pretrial phase. The Natarajan case prompted immediate and intense community response in Hillsborough Township and across Somerset County. The deaths of 2 young children in a residential neighborhood allegedly at the hands of their own mother is the kind of event that shakes a community at its foundations. Schools in the area, community organizations, and mental health service providers mobilized to support children and families in the immediate aftermath, providing the kind of crisis response infrastructure that communities rely on when tragedy of this magnitude occurs close to home. Because the Natarajan case is currently before the court and the legal proceedings are ongoing, it is important to note that the charges against Priyatharsini Natarajan represent the prosecution's position and the determination of investigators based on the evidence gathered to date. Under the American legal system, the presumption of innocence applies to every defendant until and unless the evidence presented at trial produces a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The Somerset County court system will ultimately determine the facts of this case and the accountability that follows from those facts. What the record establishes right now is this. 2 boys, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, are no longer alive. They were found in their home on January 13, 2026 by their father. Their mother has been charged with their deaths. The investigation by Somerset County law enforcement produced the evidence that supported those charges, and the court system is now the mechanism through which their case will move toward a legal conclusion. The community of Hillsborough Township has had to absorb this loss in the most immediate and visceral way. As neighbors, as parents of children who knew these boys, as community members who passed this family on the street and had no way of knowing what was taking place behind closed doors. The trauma of that kind of proximity to tragedy is real. and the resources available to support the Hillsborough community, including school-based counseling, community mental health services, and the broader infrastructure of Somerset County's Human Services Network, are a critical part of how communities recover from events that challenge their sense of safety and order. For the broader New Jersey community observing this case from a distance, it raises the same questions that every case of alleged harm to children by a parent raises. What do we miss, and what systems could catch it earlier? Those questions have no simple answers, and they do not diminish the importance of the legal process that is now underway. They are simply the questions that every community must keep asking, because the answer to preventing the next case lies somewhere in the honest confrontation with how the last one went undetected. Priyatharsini Natarajan will face the Somerset County court system in the months ahead. The legal record of her case will develop as the proceedings advance, and the accountability that those proceedings produce will be a matter of public record. For now, what stands in the record is the fact of what was found in that Hillsborough home on January 13, 2026, and the legal system's determination that those facts warrant the most serious criminal charges available under New Jersey law. The two boys deserve to be remembered not only as victims in a legal case, but as children, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, at the ages when the whole world is still discovering itself for them. When every day brings something new, and every friendship feels like the most important thing in the world. They deserved every one of those days. They should have had all of them. If this case moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Sharing these stories is how we make sure that these children are not reduced to statistics in a court filing. They were real. Their lives mattered. Case 8. Melissa Drexler, June 6, 1997, Mammoth County, New Jersey. There are cases that define a moment in time so completely that even decades later, the details remain vivid in the public consciousness. Cases where the specific details of what occurred are so striking, so far outside the range of anything that anyone present could have anticipated, that the community around them was permanently changed by the knowledge of what had happened. The case of Melissa Drexler, a name that became inseparable from the phrase prom mom in. The national press coverage that followed is exactly that kind of case. It happened in Aberdeen Township, Mammoth County, New Jersey, on the evening of June 6, 1997, in a setting that for every other teenager present that night was nothing more than a milestone celebration, a high school prom. The night that generations of young people remember as the formal beginning of their transition from adolescence into whatever comes next. For Melissa Drexler, it became something else entirely. To understand the full context of what occurred, it is necessary to understand what Melissa Drexler had concealed in the months leading up to the night of June 6. She was 18 years old, a senior at Lacey Township High School, preparing for the milestone events that marked the end of high school in America. She was also unknown to virtually everyone in her life pregnant. The pregnancy had progressed to full term. Melissa had concealed it throughout from her family, from her friends, from her school community, and from anyone else who might have intervened, offered support, or ensured that she received medical care. By the night of the prom, she was carrying a pregnancy that had reached its conclusion. The prom was held at a venue in the Aberdeen Township area of Mammoth County. As the evening progressed and her classmates danced and celebrated, Melissa Drexler made her way to a bathroom in the facility. In that bathroom, she delivered the baby. The newborn arrived in the world in the most isolated and unassisted circumstances imaginable, in a bathroom stall, without medical support, without any of the infrastructure that surrounds a birth in any planned setting. What happened to the newborn in the minutes following birth is what sent this case into the Mammoth County criminal court system. The infant did not survive. Melissa Drexler left the bathroom and returned to the prom. She danced. She ate dinner at the celebration with her date and her classmates. She remained at the event while investigators would later establish that her newborn was in the bathroom she had left behind. The discovery of the infant prompted the emergency response that led to the criminal investigation. Melissa Drexler was identified as the mother and was taken into custody by Mammoth County law enforcement. The investigation established the sequence of events that had occurred in the bathroom, and the resulting charges reflected the severity of those events. Melissa Drexler was charged with murder in the first degree. She was 18 years old. The case generated national press coverage on a scale that few New Jersey criminal cases had ever matched. The image of a teenager attending her prom while her newborn lay in a bathroom was so jarring, so contrary to the environment of celebration that surrounded it, that media outlets across the country focused intensely on every detail of the case and the young woman at its center. The legal proceedings in the Drexler case moved through the Monmouth County court system with significant public attention at every stage. Melissa Drexler and her legal team ultimately entered into a plea agreement with Monmouth County prosecutors. She pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter, a charge that carries a different legal framework than first-degree murder, one that involves a reckless act resulting in death rather than the intentional taking of a life with premeditation. The distinction between murder and aggravated manslaughter is legally significant and reflects a determination about the specific mental state of the defendant at the time of the act. Under the terms of her plea agreement, Melissa Drexler was sentenced to 15 years in New Jersey State Prison. The sentence was the formal legal acknowledgement of what had occurred on June 6, 1997, and of the accountability the court held that she bore for the outcome of that night. What followed the sentencing was the part of this case that many people find most difficult to reconcile with the length of the sentence originally imposed. Melissa Drexler served approximately 3 years of her 15-year sentence before being released on parole in 2001. Her release came after a parole board determination that she met the criteria for early release under New Jersey's parole system. The 3-year timeline measured against the 15-year sentence, and the life that was lost on June 6, 1997, generated significant public debate about the appropriateness of the outcome. That debate is part of the ongoing conversation that communities must have about how the legal system handles cases involving young defendants, concealed pregnancies, and the circumstances that produce moments of catastrophic decision-making by teenagers who have not disclosed or addressed the reality of their situations. Mental health advocates, reproductive health professionals, and legal scholars have all engaged with the Drexler case as a reference point in discussions about the support systems available to young people facing unplanned pregnancies and about the relationship between the absence of that support and the tragic outcomes that occasionally follow. The Pro-Mom case, as it was known in the media, never fully left the public consciousness. It was revisited in multiple documentary formats, in legal studies, and in broader cultural discussions about teenage pregnancy, crisis decision-making, and the consequences that result when young people in desperate situations have no support network or no belief that a support network is available to them. The case remains a reference point in New Jersey criminal history and in the national conversation about how communities and systems serve young people in crisis. The infant born in that bathroom in Aberdeen Township on June 6, 1997, lived for only the briefest span of time. That span was measured in minutes. The child's entire existence was confined to a bathroom stall at a high school prom. The legal system's engagement with that life, the charges, the plea, the sentence, the parole constitutes the formal record of the accountability framework that Monmouth County and New Jersey applied to what happened. Whether that record fully captures the weight of what was lost is a question that communities continue to hold without a satisfying answer. If the Drexler case is part of the New Jersey criminal history that you think deserves continued discussion, and the ongoing questions it raises about support systems for young people in crisis suggest that it does, please share this video, like it, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more documentary content that takes these stories seriously. We will continue now with Case 9. Case 9 Yuhwei, November 9, 2021, Somerset County, New Jersey. There are cases that place the intersection of mental health, parental crisis, and child safety before the court system in terms that require every institution involved to operate at the fullest extent of its capacity to understand what happened, why it happened, and how to respond in a way that serves both justice and the broader community interest. The case of Yuhwei in Hillsborough Township, Somerset County, New Jersey, is one of the most complex and disturbing cases in recent New Jersey history from precisely this perspective. It involves the loss of 2 children, a 7-month-old and a 10-year-old, in a set of circumstances surrounding the events of November 9, 2021, that raise profound questions about the depths of psychiatric crisis and the consequences it can produce for the most vulnerable people in a family's orbit. Somerset County has appeared in this documentary more than once. Hillsborough Township, the community at the center of this case, is the same township where the January 2026 case involving Priyatharsini Natarajan, occurred. The recurrence of Somerset County's name in connection with cases of this nature is not an indictment of the community. It is a reflection of the reality that no community is immune to the catastrophic consequences of mental health crises when they are not identified and addressed before they reach the point of irreversible harm. On November 9, 2021, emergency services received a call that brought them to a location in Hillsborough Township where a vehicle was parked with Yuhwei Chou and her 2 children inside. What first responders found when they arrived established the facts that would drive every subsequent investigation and legal proceeding. Chou's 2 children, a 7-month-old infant and a 10-year-old child, had lost their lives. Yuhwei was found in the vehicle with her hands bound to the steering wheel with a zip tie. The physical condition in which she was found, her hands restrained in a manner that prevented her from acting freely, added an immediate layer of complexity to the scene and to the investigative questions that followed. Somerset County investigators conducted a thorough examination of the scene, the vehicle, the physical evidence, and the circumstances surrounding the events of that November day. The investigation produced findings that supported criminal charges against Yuhwei Chou. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of her children. The charges reflected the prosecutorial determination that the evidence supported a finding that she had caused the deaths of both the 7-month-old and the 10-year-old. The legal proceedings that followed were shaped by the same fundamental question that had shaped the Naomi Elkins case in Ocean County: whether the mental state of the defendant at the time of the events as established through comprehensive forensic psychiatric evaluation met the legal standard for not guilty by reason of insanity under New Jersey law. The defense in Yuhwei Chou's case pursued exactly this argument, and the legal proceedings involved extensive psychiatric examination by multiple court-appointed and defense-retained experts over the years following the charges. The psychiatric evaluation process in cases of this kind is rigorous and is intended to be so. New Jersey courts take the insanity defense seriously precisely because it is a high standard that requires genuine and thorough documentation of the defendant's mental state. The evaluations conducted in the Chou case established to the court's satisfaction that Yuhwei Chou had been suffering from a severe psychiatric condition at the time of the events of November 9, 2021, a condition that impaired her ability to understand the nature of her conduct or to recognize that it was wrong within the legal framework that defines criminal culpability in New Jersey. In August of 2025, nearly 4 years after the events of November 2021, Yuhwei was found not guilty by reason of insanity on both counts. The verdict placed her in the same legal category as Naomi Elkins in Ocean County, not criminally convicted, but also not free. The not guilty by reason of insanity finding in New Jersey carries with it the requirement of court-ordered psychiatric confinement and ongoing judicial supervision of the defendant's treatment and status. As of the production of this documentary, Yuhwei Chou remains under court-ordered psychiatric supervision. The detail of the zip tie on her wrists, hands bound to the steering wheel, has been part of the public discussion surrounding this case from the beginning. Its significance, within the totality of the evidence and the psychiatric evaluation findings, is part of the record that the court examined. Its presence in the public account of this case is a detail that many observers have identified as relevant to understanding the state that Chou was in on that November day, but it is also a detail that the full legal record must contextualize rather than isolate. Somerset County's community response to the Chou case, as with the Natarajan case, reflected the particular difficulty of processing events that occur within what appear to be ordinary family households. The invisibility of severe psychiatric crisis, the way that it can develop without visible external markers, the way that it can reach catastrophic intensity without triggering the intervention systems that exist around families, is one of the most persistent challenges in community mental health infrastructure. New Jersey's mental health system, like mental health systems across the country, has faced ongoing criticism regarding the adequacy of outreach to families experiencing crisis, the accessibility of inpatient and intensive outpatient psychiatric care, and the mechanisms through which family members, teachers, and community contacts can raise concerns about a parent's mental health in a way that produces a timely and appropriate response. The Chou case, like the Elkins case in Ocean County, represents the catastrophic endpoint of a psychiatric deterioration that the community systems surrounding that family were not able to identify and address in time. The 7-month-old and the 10-year-old at the center of this case were children at opposite ends of early childhood. One barely arrived in the world, the other at the age of emerging independence and growing understanding of their place in the community around them. Both deserved every day beyond November 9, 2021. Both deserve the chance to grow, to change, to become whoever they were going to be. Their loss is not diminished by any verdict, and it is not resolved by any legal proceeding. It is simply the irreversible center of this case, and it is the reason that this community and this documentary refuses to let their story be forgotten. If this case made you think about the mental health resources available in your own community, particularly for parents in crisis, we encourage you to look into the resources provided by the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which offers crisis support, family resources, and advocacy at the national and state level. Early intervention saves lives. Knowing where to turn is the first step. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if you want to continue following these stories with us. One more case remains in today's documentary, and it is one that the New Jersey court system resolved with the full weight of the law. Stay with us. Case 10. Heather Reynolds, May 10, 2018, Camden County, New Jersey. We come now to the final case in today's documentary, and it is a case from Camden County, New Jersey that the state's court system resolved with a verdict and a sentence that placed full accountability squarely in the legal record. Unlike some of the cases examined in this documentary, the Heather Reynolds case did not end in a legal determination that removed criminal culpability. It did not produce a PTI resolution or a not guilty by reason of insanity finding. It produced a conviction, and it produced a sentence that reflected the court's determination that what happened to 17-month-old Axel Reynolds on May 10, 2018 in Gloucester Township, Camden County, warranted the most severe penalty available under New Jersey law. Camden County occupies the southwestern part of New Jersey across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. Gloucester Township is one of the largest municipalities in Camden County, a community of residential neighborhoods, commercial corridors, and the full range of families and households that make up a suburban New Jersey township. The Reynolds household was located within this community. Heather Reynolds was Axel's mother. He was 17 months old in May of 2018. 17 months is an age of particular charm and vulnerability in the developmental arc of childhood. At 17 months, most children have begun to walk, to say their first words, to develop the stubborn early individualism that characterizes toddlerhood. They are beginning to recognize themselves as separate people with preferences and personalities. They laugh at things that delight them. They reach for the people they trust. They are at 17 months in the full opening of a life. They are also entirely without the ability to protect themselves or to communicate what happens to them in terms that any adult outside the household can hear. Axel Reynolds was at that exact stage of his development on May 10, 2018. He did not survive to reach 18 months. Camden County law enforcement and emergency medical services responded to the Reynolds residence in Gloucester Township on that date, following a report involving a young child. The medical response determined that Axel had been subjected to harm that caused him to lose his life. The forensic and investigative process that followed established the circumstances of what had occurred. Investigators determined that Axel had been suffocated. The means by which his life was cut short was a cleaning wipe used against a 17-month-old child who could not have understood what was happening to him or resisted it in any meaningful way. Heather Reynolds was charged with murder in connection with Axel's death. The charges moved through the Camden County court system over the years following May 2018, proceeding through the full range of pretrial proceedings, evidence examination, and legal argument that a first-degree murder case requires. At no point in those proceedings did the evidence produce a determination that Heather Reynolds bore diminished culpability for what happened to Axel. The evidence that prosecutors presented, the forensic findings, and the investigative record all supported the first-degree murder charge that the county had filed. In November of 2022, 4.5 years after Axel Reynolds lost his life in Gloucester Township, Heather Reynolds was convicted of murder in the first degree by the Camden County court system. The sentence that followed the conviction was life in prison without the possibility of parole. It is the most serious sentence available in the state of New Jersey, a state that does not impose the death penalty. Life without parole means precisely what it says. Heather Reynolds will remain in New Jersey State Prison for the remainder of her natural life. She will not be eligible for parole consideration. She will not have the opportunity that Melissa Drexler had, or that the defendants in the PTI cases had, to return to ordinary life after a period of time. The court determined that the gravity of what happened to Axel Reynolds, a 17-month-old child suffocated by a cleaning wipe in his own home, warranted permanent removal of the person responsible from society. The sentencing hearing in the Reynolds case, like all sentencing hearings in cases involving the deaths of children, was an occasion for those connected to the case to speak about what had been lost. Axel Reynolds was 17 months old. He had people in his life who loved him, people for whom his loss is not an entry in a court filing, but the central defining absence around which the rest of their lives have reorganized. The permanence of Heather Reynolds' sentence does not restore Axel. It does not